Okay, so today we're going to jump into this interview with Terrence Howard.
All right.
And,
Uh-huh.
this is something that you sent to me,
Yeah.
and it's from the Valuetainment YouTube channel. I guess I'm sort of curious, what made you want to bring this to the show, and what were you hoping to kind of dig into?
Well, yeah, I've always been interested in hearing from people within the entertainment industry
Right.
and their experiences and, their perspectives, especially those who are willing to share maybe the less glamorous
Yeah.
or the less discussed
Behind the scenes stuff?
behind the scenes things.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think it's really valuable
Yeah.
to get those insights. So when I came across this interview with Terrence Howard, I was immediately intrigued
Okay.
because he seemed very open and,
Yeah.
and direct about his experiences in Hollywood.
Yeah, and he definitely does not hold back.
He does not.
And so I think for our listeners, the interview itself is titled, Puffy Tried to X-Shuck Me. Terrence Howard reveals shocking Diddy meeting and Hollywood's dark secrets.
Catchy title.
Yeah. Valuetainment
As valuetainers.
YouTube channel. So you can check that out if you're interested.
Absolutely.
But, for this deep dive,
Mm-hmm.
I think, what we want to do is really kind of go through some of the most fascinating and interesting
Mm-hmm.
and maybe thought-provoking claims and ideas that he shares.
Yeah, and he's got a lot of them in this interview.
He does.
There's a lot to unpack. So
Yeah.
we've got a selection of excerpts from the video transcript, and I think we can focus on a few key themes.
Yeah. And just for context for people listening, this is Terrence Howard. We're talking about, the actor.
Yeah.
But he also identifies, as someone who's involved in science.
Yeah, that's right. He wears a lot of hats.
Mm-hmm.
So
Interesting.
he brings a really unique perspective to the table.
He does.
And that's partly why I think this interview is so compelling.
Yeah.
He doesn't shy away from sharing his opinions.
Yeah.
Some of them might be controversial.
Yeah.
But he really puts himself out there.
Yeah. And I think that's what makes this a very entertaining and engaging
Mm-hmm.
interview, because he doesn't pull any punches.
No.
And so, what I'm really curious to dig into is his perspective on, this idea of maintaining your integrity
Right.
and your sense of self when you're facing these pressures of the entertainment industry. I mean,
Yeah.
that's really, I think, at the heart of a lot of what he talks about.
Absolutely. And I think one of the most interesting things that comes up is this concept of the man card.
Yeah, the man card.
This seems to be a recurring theme.
It does, and it's like a metaphor he uses, I think, for this idea of personal integrity.
Right.
And so I guess maybe the best place to start is, like, how does he actually define this man card?
Well, he describes it as your ability and your right to be a man.
Okay.
And he makes a point of saying that a man gives this card.
Interesting.
It can't be taken away from you.
Oh, so it's something that you surrender almost.
Yes, exactly.
It's a choice.
And that's a really interesting distinction, I think.
Mm.
So what does he say then about, like, what happens when someone gives up this man card?
Well, he believes that when you give it up, whether it's because of fear or the desire for gain,
Right.
or succumbing to pressure
For the industry
from the industry,
Yeah.
he believes it leads to a loss of what he calls spiritual energy.
Wow.
And this is a loss, he thinks, from which individuals rarely recover.
That's a pretty huge claim.
It is.
Yeah.
It's a big statement.
Yeah.
He's saying this is a fundamental shift.
Almost like irreversible.
Almost like,
Yeah.
yeah,
Wow.
there are consequences to these choices.
Okay.
And he's very clear about that. And he even ties this back to, those who attended, like, the Puffy parties.
Yes.
And he's sort of, I think, implying, certain behaviors that went on there.
He is, and he uses some pretty strong language to
Mhm.
describe it.
He does.
He suggests that they were punked out and pimped out.
Right.
And he attributes this to having desires
Uh-huh.
that were greater than being a man.
So it sounds like he's making a judgment call on
Oh,
those
absolutely.
who attended these parties.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
He's saying, you made a choice.
You compromised your man card, essentially.
Exactly. You gave up something
Wow. Oh,
to get something else.
And he also goes on to talk about actors who become, he uses the term fluid.
Yeah.
And I think he's implying that in doing so, they lose a foundation
Right.
and they struggle to recover that.
Yeah, he seems to be drawing a connection between,
Mhm.
this idea of giving up your man card and this fluidity. And again, it's a subjective perspective, but
Yeah.
he really believes that this has consequences.
Okay, so I guess I'm curious, like, does he give any specific examples of people who he thinks, fall into this category?
He does. He mentions Bieber
Okay,
as an
so
example
yeah.
of someone who he perceives as struggling with this.
Okay.
And again, it's his interpretation.
Yeah.
But he's using these examples
Mhm.
to illustrate this point.
Okay, so this man card, it's not just about men.
No.
He also kind of applies it to women.
Yeah, he extends this idea
Mhm.
to women in Hollywood as well.
Okay.
He suggests that, women who trade their bodies for roles,
Yeah.
they might achieve success.
Yeah, the outward success.
The outward success,
Right.
the awards, the money.
Right.
But he thinks they ultimately lose their initial dream and their soul.
Okay, so there's this cost
There's a cost.
to this kind of compromise.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He's saying it's not just about the external validation.
Right.
There's something deeper at stake.
Interesting. And to kind of illustrate this point,
Yeah.
he uses this really striking analogy,
He does.
this idea of winning Nobel Prizes, but having to betray your integrity
Mm-hmm.
to get there.
Yeah.
And he really questions, what is the value of that achievement?
Right. Is it worth it?
Right. If you've given up something so fundamental.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He's forcing us to confront these difficult questions.
It is very thought-provoking.
It is.
And then he kind of shifts gears and he brings in this biological element
Yeah.
where he links being a man to this inherent aggression.
Mm-hmm.
And he even mentions sperm production.
Right. He gets very specific.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think this is where, his definition becomes more rooted in traditional gender roles.
Right.
And it's important to recognize that,
Yeah.
that's the lens through which he's viewing this.
Okay. So keeping that in mind, this whole man card thing, I think really serves as a backdrop for understanding his account of this interaction with Sean Diddy Combs.
Yes. This story is really interesting.
It is. And he calls him Puffy.
Puffy.
Yeah. So just to be clear.
Puffy.
But this story really, I think, illustrates, his man card concept in action.
It does. It's a very specific example
Yeah.
of how he claims he's always refused
Mhm.
to compromise himself.
Okay, so how does the story start?
Well, he recounts being invited by Puffy to be his acting coach.
Okay, so they're going to work together.
That's the idea.
Right.
But he describes the initial meeting as very strange.
Okay.
He says Combs was just sitting around looking at him,
Doing nothing.
not really talking about any material.
Not really talking about acting,
Yeah.
just looking at him.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a little strange.
A little awkward,
Yeah.
to say the least.
Okay, and then what happens?
So later on, Howard played his music for Combs. And again, according to Howard, Combs just sat there and looked at him.
Really? So the same kind of vibe.
Same vibe.
Weird.
Very strange.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so is this where the Tart GF DACME comes in?
Well, this is where things take a turn.
Okay.
Howard's assistant
Mm-hmm.
actually suggests that Combs was trying to Ashtuck him.
Wow. Okay, so that's the assistant's
That's the interpretation.
interpretation of the
Oh,
situation.
yes.
Okay.
And this seems to be what really
Sets him off.
changes things for Howard.
Okay.
He says after that, he cut off all communication
Wow.
with Combs.
Okay, so he's drawing a line in the sand.
Yeah.
He's not having it.
No.
Yeah, okay.
This is a violation.
Right. And so this whole anecdote, it really does exemplify, like you said, this man card thing.
It does. He's saying, I'm not going to bend over.
Right.
I'm not going to compromise
Yeah.
myself.
He's standing his ground.
He's standing his ground.
Yeah. And it leads into, some of the other things he talks about in terms of how he's reacted to other unwanted advances and propositions,
Yeah, he talks about responding to producers who
Mhm.
made advances
Right.
with threats of violence.
Wow. Okay, so he's not messing around.
No.
He's very serious about this.
Very serious.
Yeah.
He says he would threaten to punch them in the mouth
Wow.
or knock their head off.
Okay, so I guess I'm curious then, is he saying that this is how he thinks all men should react?
Well, he makes a distinction between how you treat a guy versus a man.
Okay.
And he's saying that a real man
Uh-huh.
will have a strong reaction to
Okay.
any challenge to his masculinity.
So again, this goes back to his very specific definition of what it means to be a
Yes,
man.
exactly.
Right.
It informs his actions
Yeah.
and his worldview.
And he's very consistent in this.
He is.
Like he's saying he always strives to be the man
Always be the man.
in the room.
Yeah, that's his motto.
Okay. And has this stance.
Yeah.
Has it cost him opportunities?
He admits that it has.
Okay.
He says he's lost business because of it.
Wow.
Yeah.
So he's willing to pay that price
Yeah.
for sticking to his principles.
He's willing to walk away
Yeah.
from things that he doesn't feel align with his values.
Wow. And what are some specific examples of things that he's refused to do?
He mentions refusing gay roles
Okay.
or kissing men on screen
Oh,
as examples.
Of things that he's just not willing to do.
Yeah, he's drawing a line.
Yeah.
He's very clear about his boundaries.
And so I think, that really paints a picture of someone who's very firm in his convictions.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting to think about the pressures that people face in Hollywood.
Right.
And maybe in other industries too.
Absolutely.
And how they navigate those pressures and how they choose to respond.
And everyone has their own way
Yeah.
of dealing with it.
Yeah. And so I guess, the question then becomes, given all of this, given these experiences, given his strong views,
Mm-hmm.
where does he stand now
Right.
in Hollywood?
Well, he's still working.
Really?
Yeah, he says he's still on the Chitlin circuit.
Okay.
So he's still taking roles
Yeah.
to earn a living.
And so I guess what he's saying is he hasn't yet made enough money to pursue his other interests.
That's what he says.
Okay.
Yeah, he's very open about that.
Yeah.
He hasn't reached that level of financial independence.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what are these other interests that he's talking about?
Well, he's very passionate about science
Okay.
and invention.
Interesting. Yeah.
He has a lot of other things that he wants to do.
And so it sounds like, despite his criticisms of Hollywood,
Mm-hmm.
there's still this practical aspect to his continued involvement.
There is.
Yeah.
He needs to earn a living.
Right.
And he's using his acting career
Mm-hmm.
to fund his other passions.
Interesting. And he even talks about, having achieved his main ambition already.
He says he believes he's accomplished
Mm-hmm.
his primary objective.
And what is that objective?
Well, he describes it as redefining the universe.
Wow. Okay. So that's a pretty ambitious goal.
It is.
Yeah.
He thinks big.
Yeah.
And he points to his patents
Okay.
as evidence of this.
So he's serious about his science.
He is.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's not just dabbling.
Okay.
He's really committed to it.
And so I guess I'm curious, do you think that his continued work in Hollywood, is it at odds with his, very strong pronouncements about integrity?
It's an interesting question.
Hmm.
And I think it reveals a certain complexity.
Yeah.
He's obviously critical of the industry,
Right.
but he's still participating in it.
Yeah.
And I think it suggests that he's made a very specific calculation about
Mhm.
what he's willing to do
Right.
to achieve his broader goals. So it's not a simple black and white situation.
No, it definitely isn't.
Yeah.
Okay. So, taking a step back, I think this deep dive into Terrence Howard's interview
Mhm.
has really given us a lot to think about.
A lot to unpack.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We've explored this very unique concept
Mhm.
of the man card as a representation of personal integrity.
And the cost of compromising it.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think it really prompts you to think about, what is your own personal code of conduct?
Right. What are your non-negotiables?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And we also examined his account of that very uncomfortable encounter with Sean Combs,
Right.
which he saw as, this refusal to compromise his principles.
Yeah, standing his ground.
Yeah. And that really highlights, I think, the importance of setting and maintaining personal boundaries.
Absolutely.
And then finally, we touched on his reflections on his career path.
Mm-hmm.
And, this idea of balancing creative and practical needs. And I think, all of this really leads us to some pretty significant questions.
It does.
In whatever field you're working in, what does it actually mean
Mm-hmm.
to maintain your personal integrity while you're trying to achieve success.
What are you willing to sacrifice?
Yeah.
What lines won't you cross?
Right.
Yeah.
And are there universal lines in the sand
Mm-hmm.
that you wouldn't cross no matter what?
What are your core values?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, most importantly, it makes you think about
Mm-hmm.
the potential consequences